Hello again, everyone. So I just wanted to do a quick video today to kind of touch on the concept of the different fairy courts that are out there. And I've talked a lot already about the Scottish court, specifically the Seelie and the Unseelie. And I know sometimes I can make it sound like that's very restricted and really only applies to the Scottish, which is because it does. It comes from Scottish folklore. It's really a Scottish folkloric concept, and it doesn't apply outside of that. When you see sources talking about Irish fairies, specific types of Irish otherworldly beings, or different Irish fairy queens or kings being part of the Seelie or Unseelie court, that's usually a sign it's not really a good source. So I do kind of emphasize that so that people can be aware of it. However, there are also other concepts out there relating to categorizing fairies as different types of groupings, courts, if you will. Court in various types of meanings. So, for example, one of the more popular ones you see that's more disconnected from the Scottish concept is the idea of the bright court, which would be the so-called good or benevolent fairies, and the dark court, which would be the so-called negative or more dangerous fairies. And bright and dark in these concepts are kind of the same as like day and night, literal lightness versus literal absence of light kind of concepts. We also see, particularly across the last 20 years or so, this growing idea of dividing the good folk into two groups aligned with the seasons. So you would have the summer court then and the winter court. And this is kind of moving away from the concept of the Seelie and Unseelie, which of course, being from Scotland and being in the Scots language, have very particular meanings. And taking it out of those meanings and aligning them with the seasons so that then the associations are based on how things connect to or relate to the ideas of winter or summer, whichever season they're connected to. And you will see, because of fiction, kind of adopting those ideas. Additionally, the idea of more and more complex systems, more and more courts, specifically adding in spring and autumn. We'll point out, though, that for most cultures, particularly Western European cultures, there originally weren't concepts of spring and autumn so much. It really was just summer and winter, and you would kind of have a clear division of the year into two halves based on that. Now, to be completely clear, these are all very new ideas. These are all ideas that we see coming in over the last 20 or 30 years. They don't reflect older folklore or folk belief. They kind of reflect new directions that people are moving in with belief, new folklore, if you will. So these aren't things that you're going to find attached to any specific culture. These are things that you're going to find more as an innovation or a new way of looking at these ideas. And there's nothing wrong with something being new. We just have to understand and acknowledge that it's new. That this idea of like a summer and a winter court, for example, are not coming to us from ancient Ireland, definitely not, or, Scottish folklore, also not, or Welsh or anything like that. These are new ideas that people are kind of innovating based on their different interpretations of the older folklore, and also based on personal gnosis, personal experiences, their own ideas with things. I personally happen to really like the idea of summer and winter, sort of those seasonal associations, with the understanding that they're not strict, harsh delineations. Just because you might have the summer court, we might perceive as the more benevolent or kindly inclined beings of the other world, doesn't mean those beings aren't around in the winter, which is where we are now. Just that this isn't their primary time. They don't have as much influence or sway in the winter as they do in the summer. And the same is true vice versa. The beings that we would see being kind of dominant in the winter are still going to be around in the summer. They're just not going to have the same power and influence. We do see this idea in fiction, but we do also see it in active belief. So I wanted to talk a little about that today, put that out there for people to consider, and also emphasize that while these are newer ideas, newer folk beliefs, if you will, they aren't necessarily wrong or bad because they're new. We just have to have them in that context. If this is something you believe, awesome. This is something you believe. Just be aware that this is something that is a newer belief. And again, nothing wrong with that. If you like the 4-court system with spring and summer, or spring, summer, autumn, and winter, then that's also perfectly fine. Just be aware that it's a newer belief. There's no real strong folklore connected to it. I would also kind of put out there and be a little hesitant to start assigning particularly named fairy kings and fairy queens from different cultures into these newer concepts. That may be something that organically happens over time, but a lot of times when people kind of sit down to do that, it ends up being forced and not working particularly well. If we're talking, for example, about like Irish fairy kings and queens, they don't have a seasonal association. They would have a regional association. So you would have like Cliona, Queen Cliona, ruling down in the area around Cork. But that would be year-round. That's just her place. It's always her place. The same way with King Finvara in Galway, and so on. So you can't really take them out of that and then try to insert them into either the Scottish system with the Seelie and Unseelie or the more modern seasonal understanding. It's not going to work particularly well, and it's probably going to feel forced and awkward. So I don't recommend trying to do that. But my own personal spiritual approach, I do have the concept of the summer court and the winter court, and the rulers there go by titles, not by names. So that's one option to put out there for people to consider as sort of a solution to this. In my fiction, I do use the terms dark court and light court. I will say there is some controversy over using the terms dark and light because historically in magical practice there is sort of a lot of racist associations with those terms, the idea of white magic and black magic, and some people kind of carry those concepts over a bit into the idea of dark and light. The only thing I'll really say to that is when we're talking about the fairy courts, it's really not directly equivalent the way we would be talking about it in magical practice, or among people who have different forms of magical practice. It's kind of a separate concept, and from my research at least, it comes from a very different root. It was a way in the 80s and 90s to try to not use the Scots words Seelie and Unseelie, and instead view Seelie as the light or bright court because they're the more benevolent, positive, daytime kind of energy, and the Unseelie, who are the more dangerous, more malicious, sort of nighttime, darker energy in that sense. Like I said, this is all a little controversial. I do want to put this out there so that everyone's aware of that. I do use it in my fiction. I started doing that in 2014. If I was starting my fiction today, to be honest, I might not use those same terms, but here we are. And it is something to consider if you don't want to use Seelie and Unseelie because it is definitely such a Scottish concept. You want something that feels a little more universal. You do have some options. Again, just be aware that these are newer concepts and that you have to be careful how or if you apply them to older folklore. You really don't want to go back and sort of retroactively decide that you're going to apply these new ideas and terms to folklore that's been around for 100 years, 200 years, and that's really embedded in a particular culture. especially if you're not from that particular culture, because that's not appropriate, not a good look for anybody. But for modern understandings on sort of a wider general sense with these beings, these are some options to consider. And I do think it's better to look at using, say, winter and summer as opposed to Seelie and Unseelie, particularly if you are taking that wider view, because you're not kind of taking it out of a culture and applying it elsewhere outside of that. You would be more respecting that culture by leaving it alone, using a new and different term that can be used more universally. And also, obviously, summer and winter, you don't have the negative connotations you might have with, say, dark and light. And you also still maintain sort of that benevolent, beneficent idea with summer, and the darker, more dangerous idea when it comes to winter, how most people view these seasons. So, it is a concept that has a lot of, I think, depth and value to it. We just have to be really aware of all the layers going on, the newness in particular. So, quick video today, but those are some of my thoughts. You will see the seasonal courts mentioned constantly across urban fantasy and fiction. Again, just when you see it, it's awesome. Keep in mind the source is fiction. So if you are going to use it in your personal belief system, just be clear that you're getting it from fiction or you were inspired by the fiction, and don't try to act like it's older folklore. I have seen people doing that, trying to apply these things to older folklore as if that's where they come from. Just be honest about your sources. It's perfectly fine to believe something that's a new or innovative belief. Just be clear on where you're getting it. It doesn't have to be old to have value. I promise. As much as I love older folklore, it's still true. It doesn't have to be old to have value. So, these are my quick thoughts on some of the alternate fairy court concepts that are out there. Always welcome thoughts and comments if anyone has any to add. Otherwise, it's a beautiful snowy day here where I am. I was out playing in it earlier, and I might be out playing in it some more later. So I will let everyone get back to their day. Have a good time. Think about what summer and winter mean to you, and if that makes sense as a way to sort of understand a division of the good folk. With the understanding always that there really never is an easy way to categorize these beings or to understand them. They break boundaries. They're liminal by nature. They don't like to fit in little boxes. But human beings love categories and love little boxes and love understanding things based on putting them in a specific sort of category. So if this is an easy way for you to understand them, there's some things to consider. Otherwise, I will see everyone later, and I will try to do another video soon. Probably not when it's snowing. Bye.